In this tutorial, we're going to create a simple CRUD application, where CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. And for our backend, we're going to use Firestore, which is the database offered by Firebase. So let's start by creating a brand new Flutter application. So I already have the Flutter extension installed on Visual Studio Code. So here I'm going to create Flutter new project, and I'm going to go with an empty application. I will create it in my Flutter workspace folder, and let's name it Firebase CRUD. Here we go, let's create it. And our new Flutter application was created. Let's now move on to creating a new Firebase project, and this is the project we will use for Firestore. So let's open the web browser, and we need to go to console.firebase.google.com. So here it is, console.firebase.google.com. And here, let's create a new Firebase project, and I'll name it Flutter CRUD. And let me uncheck this option, and let's continue. Here you can enable Gemini, I'm not going to do that, and let's continue. And leave this option on if you want analytics, I don't. Let's create our project. Okay, so our project is being created, let's give it a second. Great, so the project is ready, let's continue. And the first thing we need to do is to add an application to our Firebase project. So let's add app here. And here I'm going to choose the last option, which is Flutter. So I'm going to click here. And here are the steps we need to follow. So first we need to make sure that we have the Firebase CLI installed. So I can click on this link. And in my experience, the easiest way to get started with a Firebase CLI is using the npm package. So here you can choose npm. And all you need to do is run this command. I already have it installed. If you don't, just copy this command, open your terminal, paste it here, and this is about it. I'm not going to do it because I already have the Firebase CLI installed, but this is how you do it. And that's it about the installation of the Firebase CLI. Let's get back to the instructions. After we install the Firebase CLI, we need to move on to this command, Firebase login. So let me paste it in my terminal. And as you can see, it says that I'm already logged in. If I wasn't logged in, it would open the web browser, and there I would have to log in. But for me, it's already done, and we can move on. Then we have to install the SDK, of course. I already have it installed. We already created the Flutter project. And then we need to move on to creating the Flutter project itself, which I already did. So let's move on. Next, we need to run this command. So let's copy it and run it. And now Flutter will be able to work with Firebase. And then we need to configure our Flutter project to work with our Firebase project. So this project, the Flutter project, needs to know how to connect and work with the Firebase project. And as you can see here at the end, I have the ID of the Firebase project. So I need to run this command in my Firebase project, and this is what's going to connect my Flutter project to the Firebase project. So let's copy this command and let's run it in the terminal. And then we need to choose which platforms we want to configure our project for. I'm going to go with Android and web, so let me unselect the rest of them. Then I can hit enter, and it's creating the apps on the Firebase project and connecting the Flutter project to the Firebase project. And now we can see that here we have a new file called Firebase options. So everything our Flutter project needs to connect to the Firebase project will be here. So this is done, and let's click on next again to move on. And then we can see this line here. And this is something that we have to run in our Flutter application before we're doing anything else with the Firebase project. This initializes the connection with Firebase, and only once this is done, we are going to be able to work with anything that has to do with Firebase. So in my project, I want to have a file called Firestore Manager. Firestore is the only feature of Firebase that I'm going to use in this project, and this is why I want to call it Firestore Manager. So let me create this new file, and I want it to be in my lib folder, and as I said, I'm going to call it Firestore Manager.dart. And here, let's create our Firestore Manager class. So the first thing I want to have in this class is the initialization code that's written here. And of course, this has to be in some kind of method. So let me call it init Firestore. And as you can see here, we have a wait, which means that this function has to be a synchronous function. So the return value is going to be a future, and we also have to use the async keyword. And now here I can copy this line and paste it to my function. And of course, we want to use something that's related to Firebase. So here we have to install two Dart packages. So let me open Google. And the first package that we're going to need is Firebase Core. So I'm going to look for pub dev Firebase Core. And the first result is Firebase core from Dart packages. Let's open it. And here is the package we need. Let me copy it. And now I'm going to open my pubspec.yaml file. Here it is. And here in the dependencies section, I'm going to add this dependency to this package. And while we're at it, let's also install the package needed for Firestore. So let's get back to Google. And now I'm going to look for pubdev Firebase Firestore. The first result is for Cloud Firestore. This is the package that we're going to need. So let me also copy this and add it to my dependencies. And let me save this file. These dependencies will be installed in my project, and they are being installed. Okay, so that's it about this. And now I should be able to import Firebase core. So let me copy over these two lines and let me paste them to my file. And notice that the second import is to Firebase options, which is the file that was created when we connected our Flutter project to the Firebase project. So I think that we're done with this. Let's continue to console. And now let me put this in a full screen for a minute. Now I'm going to expand the build options. And here we're going to choose Firestore database. And we need to create database. I'm going to go with the standard edition. So let's click on next. We need to choose a location. I'll just go with United States. And here I'm going to choose start in test mode. This is going to help us hit the ground running. If we're starting in production mode, we have to deal with security rules right from the get-go. And this is something that I don't want to do in this tutorial. And this is why I prefer to start in test mode. So let's create our database. And our new database was created. So here, after this initialization, let's add a simple log. And this is going to let us know that Firebase was initialized. Now we need to go to main.dart, our main file. And here I want to call my init Firestore function to make sure that the first thing that I'm doing in my application is initializing Firebase and Firestore. The thing is that this function is asynchronous, and this is why to be able to call it, my main function is also going to be asynchronous. So this is going to be async. And before we're doing this initialization, we have to do something else. And this is going to be widgets Flutter binding. Here it is. Dot ensure initialized. So it has to be in this order. First we call this method, and only then we are actually initializing Firebase. Now, of course, if I want to actually call this method, call my init Firestore method, I'm going to need an object. And I want to make sure that I'm only working with one object of this class. I don't want to have more than one object to deal with my Firestore database. So the way I'm going to go about it is to work with a singleton object. So here is how we're going to do that. First, I'm going to define here a private constructor. This is going to prevent direct access to the creation of more objects. And now I want to have a static final instance of my class. And this instance is the only one that's actually going to use this private constructor. When we are initializing this instance, this is the only time that we're actually going to call this private constructor. So I'm just going to copy this line and paste it here. Now we're going to be able to use this static instance to call the initialization method and initialize Firebase. So let's go back to main.dart. And here I want to access my Firestore manager class. And from this class, I'm going to be able to access my instance. And this is the only instance from this class that I'm going to have. And using this instance, I can call init Firestore. And this is what's going to initialize my connection to Firebase. And once again, since this is an asynchronous function, we'd better add here a wait. Next, I want to create my main widget. This is the widget that will be in charge of showing most of our application. So I'm just going to call it main widget. So let me create a new file in my lib folder. And as I said, I'm going to call it main widget. .dart. And I want it to be a stateful widget. So I'm going to choose Flutter stateful widget. And its name is going to be main widget. Now in my build method, let's return a scaffold, and I'm also going to add an app bar to this scaffold. And let's create a body for our scaffold. And let's start simple. I'm just going to have here a text widget. And now let's go back to our main file. And here I want to use my main widget. So instead of this scaffold, I'm going to use my main widget. And the import for this widget can probably be relative. So here I'm going to change it to relative, convert to a relative import. And let's also do that for our Firestore manager file. So this is also going to be relative. Let's now try to start our application, and it seems to be working, and we can see our main widget. Now, the first thing that I want to be able to do is add new items, new to-do items to my Firestore database. So to do that, let's get back to our Firestore manager file. And here I'm going to add a new function called add to-do item. Once again, this is going to be an asynchronous function, so the return type is going to be a future. And what this one is going to get as a parameter is a string value for the title of the new to-do item. Now, to actually go ahead and create the new to-do item, we need to put it in a collection. So how do we access one of these collections? So the first thing we need to do is right here, Firebase Firestore. And this is, of course, something that we have access to because of the Cloud Firestore package. So it had to import Cloud Firestore. And behind the scenes, this class probably also works with a singleton of its own. So if we want to actually do anything with it, we need to access its instance. And now we're going to be able to access the collections. Now, the good thing about working with Firestore is that if the collection does not exist, it will be created on the fly. So the way I want to name my collection is to-dos. And this is going to return a collection reference. Using this collection reference, we're going to be able to add documents. So here I'm going to add, and this is what's going to allow me to actually add a document. And what we need to pass to add, the way we pass our document, is as a map. So here we need the curly braces. And for this new item, I'm going to provide its title. So title. And the value of the title is, of course, going to be what I got as a parameter, which is title. And for each of my to-do items, I also want to know if it is completed or incomplete. So let's add here another field called completed, and let's initialize it with the value false, because at the beginning I don't want it to be completed yet. And notice that add is an asynchronous function, so we would better await to its completion. So this function is going to allow us to add new to-do items to our database. We're now going to use this function in our main widget. So here I want to add a text field, and this is where the user will be able to provide the new to-do item, the title of the new to-do item. And I use decoration for the hint text. And I also want to have here a button to allow the user to submit the addition of the new to-do item. And since we're now going to have more than one element in the body of this scaffold, I'm going to use a column as a container to both of them. And now I am going to be able to add my new elevated button for the submission of the new item. So let's start with an empty function, and this button should probably say add to do item. But right now it's going to be pretty hard to know what value the user provided, and this is why I'm going to use a controller. A text editing controller is very useful for cases like this, because this is going to easily allow us to access the value that the user provided. So let's define our text editing controller, and now we can connect this controller to the text field itself. So here I'm going to say that the controller for this text field is the new title controller. Now when the user adds the new to-do item, let's clear the text from the text field. So here, this is the callback for our button, and I'm going to clear my text editing controller. And now we should probably call our Firestore manager itself. So here let's access our Firestore manager. And as you remember, it is a singleton, so here I'm going to add instance. And we already have the add to do item function. So this is exactly the function we're going to use. So let's call it. And as a parameter, we need to pass the title that the user chose. And this is something that we can get from our title controller. Now, as you might remember, this is an asynchronous function. So here I'm going to add await. And because I'm now using await, this function, the callback, the on-pressed callback, has to be asynchronous itself. So let's try to add our first to-do item, and I'm just going to call it test. And let's now take a look at the Firebase console. So let's refresh this page, and you can see that we now have here a collection called to-dos, and we also have a document with some random ID. And this document has two fields, completed, which is false, and title, which was initialized to test. So it seems like we are able to now add to-dos to our database. Next, I want to be able to retrieve the to-do items that I currently have so that I can show them here. So let's get back to our Firestore manager. And here I'm going to create a new function, fetch to-do items. Once again, it's probably going to be an asynchronous function, so let's add here async. And soon we'll think about the exact type that we want to return from this function, but let's start simple, and I'm just going to write here future dynamic. So we want to retrieve all of the documents from our collection. So once again, I can access my collection the same way we did it before, using firebase.instance.collection. So I can paste it here. But actually, I prefer not to do it this way, because this is quite long, right? Firebase.instance.collection to-dos. I want to only define this collection reference once and to use it wherever I need. So let's define our collection reference here. And its type is going to be collection reference. Now, collection reference is a generic type, so we need to specify it. And most of the time, it's going to contain a map where the keys are strings and the values are dynamic. They can be anything. And this should make a lot of sense, because if once again we're taking a look at our database, we can see that indeed it is a kind of a map where the keys are strings and the values can be Boolean, can be string, or can be anything else. So this is why most of the time our collection reference is going to be of this type, a map where the keys are strings and the values are dynamic. Now notice that I don't initialize it here, because the initialization of the collection reference can be only done after we initialize the connection to Firebase. So only after we finish calling this function init Firestore, only then it is going to be safe to initialize our collection reference. So the safest way to initialize it is to put the initialization right after the call to initialize app. So here I'm actually going to initialize my collection reference, and it's basically going to be what we did here. Firebase firestore.instance.collection and then the name of the collection. And now I can simply use my collection reference both here and also here, because it is the same collection reference. I only initialized it once. But you can see that now our constructor complains, because it is saying that this non-nullable field must be initialized. Now I am going to initialize it, and I know for sure that it is going to be initialized, but I cannot do it just yet. I will do it later on in my init Firestore function, and this is why I'm going to mark it as late. This means that this field has late init, and it's basically like telling Flutter, count on me, we're not going to get a null reference error, I am going to initialize this field. Now, to actually get over the documents in the collection, we need to call the get method on the collection reference. So here I'm going to add get, and this is an asynchronous function, so here I'm going to add a wait, and let me store the result in a variable called query snapshot. And now let's extract the data from each of these documents. To do that, we're going to use a for loop to allow us to go over the documents one by one. So it's going to look this way. For, so let's call each of the documents doc. And to get the documents themselves, we're going to access the snapshot.docs. Now, the thing is that we can have more than one document, of course. Our collection can contain many documents. So this is why I'm going to have a list of these. So it's going to be a list of maps. So I created my list here, and it's a list of map, and the keys for each of these maps are strings, whereas the values are dynamic. Now we have this list, and now we're going to go over the documents in the collection and add a representation of this document to this list. So to get the data for one specific document, we can use the data function. And now I have the data for this specific document. This is exactly what I want to store in my list. So let's add the data for this document to our list. And eventually let's return our list. And now that we already know that the type of the list that we return from this function is this, it is a list of maps, I can change this dynamic, and instead of dynamic I can write here list of maps. Let's now go back to our main widget. And here I want to hold a list of the current to-dos that we're currently aware of. So let's put it here. And now I want to add in my widget a function that will call the fetch to-dos from my Firestore manager. This is going to make it easier to update the state of my widget. So let's create here a new function, and here I'll just call it get to-dos. And since we are once again going to use the instance of our Firestore manager, maybe we can store the reference to this instance in a field of this class. So I defined it here, I just called it Firestore manager. And now we should be able to use it here when we add a new item, so here, and also when we retrieve the existing to-dos. So from our Firestore manager, let's fetch the to-do items. And of course I have to add here a wait. And now I'm going to add set state, and this is because I want to update the state of this widget. So the field of the state that I want to update is this to-do list, and this is going to be equal to what I retrieved from the Firestore manager. So to-do list is going to be equal to the retrieved items. And let's add here a small log so that we know how many items we were able to retrieve. And now that we have this function, maybe we can call it as soon as our widget loads. So let's override init state. And you can choose it here among the options, override init state. And all I want to do is call my function, getToDos. And let's open our debug console and restart our application. And we can see Firebase initialized, and a second later we can see that we fetched one item from Firestore. Let's try to add a second to-do item, test2, and let's add it to our collection. And if I restart my application again, I can see that now we fetched 2 items from Firestore. Next, I want to actually show the to-dos items that we retrieved from Firestore here on the widget itself, and I'm going to do it in a different sub-widget. So let's create a new widget, and I'm going to call it current to-dos. So once again, in the lib folder, I'm going to create the new file, and it's going to be current todos.dart. And this one is not going to have a state of its own, so it's going to be a stateless widget. So let's create a new stateless widget, and I'm going to call it current to-dos. And here I'm going to expect the list of to-dos. So I want the main widget to send to this widget the current list of to-dos. So let's define it here in this class. And once again, it's going to be of the same type. It's going to be a list of maps where the keys are strings and the values are dynamic. And of course, we're going to require this field to be sent when this widget is used. So here I'm going to add required this.todo list. And this is going to force the calling widget to pass the list of current to-dos. Now, from this widget, I want to return a listview.builder. So let's return it here. And we're going to pass 2 things to our builder, the item count and the item builder. So the item count is going to be the length of this list. We want to show all of the elements in our to-do list. So the length of this list is going to be our item count. And since our to-do list is nullable, I have to add here the exclamation mark, and the item builder is where we actually going to build each and every one of the elements in this list. So it's going to be a callback, and this callback is going to have 2 parameters, context and index, where index is the index of the element that we're currently working on. So let's try to show the title for each of the elements. To do that, we can access our to-do list and specify the index of the element that we're currently working on, the one that we're currently showing, which is index. And once again, I need the exclamation mark. And each of these elements is going to be a map where the key is a string. So here I need to specify the string, and the key I want to start with is simply going to be the title. Because as you probably remember, each of our elements has title and completed. I want to start with the title. So this is what I'm going to specify here. And this is going to be inside the text widget. So for each of the elements, I'm returning a text widget with a title of the current element. And now let's try to use this widget in our main widget. So here, just above my text field, let's call current to-dos, and I need to import it. And then I am required to specify the to-do list. And as you remember, we have this field in the main widget, the to-do list. So this is what I'm going to pass. And let's try to restart the application. And it seems like we have a problem with the display here. So in the current to-dos widget, I'm going to wrap the listview.builder with expanded. And we can now see the titles of both of our to-do items. Now we should also take into account the case in which we don't have any to-dos yet. So if our to-dos list, and this is the parameter for this widget, if it is either null or empty, I'm going to simply show a text widget. So I'm going to use a ternary operator here, so a question mark. And if it is empty, I'm going to show my text widget. Otherwise, if it's not empty, I'm going to show my listview.builder. So colon here. Let's make them a bit bigger so we can change the style of our text. And I'm going to change the font size to 18. I also want to add some padding for each of them. So inside my item builder, I'm going to wrap each of the text widgets in a padding widget. So here I'm actually going to return a padding widget. Now, I want to be able to mark each of the to-dos item as either completed or incomplete. So this is why I want to add a checkbox to the left of each of them. This is why I'm going to add a checkbox to the left of each of them. Now, since my text widget is not going to be enough anymore, I first want to wrap my text widget with a row widget. And now, just before my text, I also want my checkbox. Now, the value is what's going to determine if the checkbox is going to be checked or not. And this is information that we already have for each of the to-do items. So just like we accessed the title of the to-do item, we can access its completed field. So let me copy this line, and this is going to be my value, but of course instead of title, I want to write here completed. As for the onChanged callback, we'll think about it in a minute. For now, it's just going to be an empty callback. And indeed, we can now see a checkbox to the left of each of our items. Moreover, if I now go to the database itself and edit one of my documents, as an example, let's try to edit this document, the test document. So I'm going to change its completed value from false to true. So let's update this document and let's restart the application. And you can see that now the second item is indeed checked. Now, one thing that maybe we should do is use a more specific cast here, because our to-do list is a list of maps where the values are dynamic. Now here we're using this value as a boolean. Flutter does its best to guess the correct type for dynamic types, but generally speaking, it's more secure to specify ourselves. As you see here, it worked fine and it understood correctly that it should be a boolean value, but I want to be more explicit about it, and this is why here I'm going to write as bool. It's going to do the same thing, but now I know that this value is going to be interpreted as a boolean value. The problem is that in the current implementation, if I now add a new to-do item, so for example, let's add test 3, I can add this new item, but my application does not update automatically. I still only see these two items and not the new one. So here is how we're going to solve it. Let's go back to our main widget, and here in the callback that takes care of presses to the addition button, after we're done adding the new item to the database, we're also going to call getToDos, because this is going to retrieve the updated list from the database, and then it's also going to update our local list. And this list is what we're passing as a parameter to the current TODOs widget. And this way the sub-widget, the widget that's in charge of showing the current items, should update accordingly. So let's add this call here. So await getToDos, and let's restart the application. And now I'm going to try and add a fourth one, so test 4. And if I'm adding this one to the database, I can see that my application does update and I can see here the new item. Next, I want to improve the display of the tasks a bit more, because what I think might look a bit better is if we're using a strike-through through tasks that are already done. Like for example, if I'm marking this to do as completed, I want a line through it. So here is how we can do that. I'm going to go back to my current to-dos widget, and here's the text widget that we're using to show the text of the to-do item. Now, if I just wanted a strike through all of them, it would be pretty simple. All I need to do for this is to add inside my text style decoration, and the value for the decoration needs to be text decoration dot line through. And now we can see that all of our tasks have a line through them. The thing is that I don't necessarily want this line, I only want it for tasks that are already marked as completed. So once again, we can use a ternary operator, and the condition is exactly what we have here. We need to access the current element, the current item, and from it we need to access its completed value and convert it to a boolean value. So I'm going to take what we have here, and this is going to be our condition. Now, if the condition is true, if it is fulfilled, we know that this item is already completed, and in this case we want the strike through. Otherwise, and this is why I'm going to have here a colon, I'm just going to use text decoration.none. And if I save this updated file, I can see that now only test2 has a strike through because it is completed. Now, currently our checkboxes are shown, but they do not do anything. I mean, if I try to check this checkbox, it doesn't do anything, it doesn't react. And the reason that we cannot mark it as completed is because the value does not change. As you can see here, the value is always what we retrieved from the database. It is the completed value for this to-do item, and it just stays whatever we retrieved from the database. So even if I try to change it, it doesn't do anything. If we really want to be able to mark existing tasks as completed, we need to do something in our onChanged callback. But I don't want to do it here, because this widget is supposed to be simple and stateless. So first we need to implement in our Firestore manager the ability to update existing tasks. Specifically, I want to be able to change their completed status, whether or not they are marked as completed. So I'm going to create here a new function, and I'm going to call it change task status. And as a parameter, I want a boolean value, and I call it completed. And this needs to be the updated value of the task that we want to update. Now, the thing is that the way it's implemented now, we're not going to be able which task is the one that needs to be updated. And this is why this function must have another parameter for the ID. This ID is going to help us know which of the elements is the one that we need to update. So here I'm going to add a first parameter called ID. Now, Firestore itself already has these IDs. Every document has a unique ID. So let's take a quick look at our Firestore database. And indeed, we can see that each of our documents has some random long ID. This is the ID that we want to use to know which of the items we are talking about. In a minute, we will have to think how we're going to retrieve this ID, how we're going to know the ID of the item that we want to update. But for a second, let's assume that we already know it. If we do know it, then updating an existing document is pretty similar to adding a new one. So let me copy this line, and it's going to be very similar, but not exactly the same thing. Once again, I'm going to use my collection reference, but this time I want to access one specific document. And this is why, using my collection reference, I'm going to access the document, which can be done using doc. And as a parameter to doc, I need to pass the ID of the document that I want to update. And this is exactly the reason I had to have this parameter, the ID parameter. So let's pass the ID, and now we have access to the specific document that we want to update. And now we can update the document using the update function. And once again, we're passing a map, and this is why we have here the curly braces, but we don't have to update everything. We don't have to update all of the fields of the document. We actually need to only pass the fields that need to be updated. So in my case, I don't want to update the title, right? This function is only supposed to update the completion status. So I'm not going to pass the title, but I am going to pass an updated value for completed. And the updated value is not necessarily going to be false, it's going to be completed, what we got in the parameter. And now that we have this function in our Firestore manager, I don't want to access it directly from here, because this is supposed to be a simple stateless widget. So actually, the widget that I want to use this function, I want it to be here. Similar to the way that our main widget has its own getToDos function that uses the Firestore manager fetchToDo, I'm going to do here something very similar. So here I'm going to add a new function, and let's call it change task status. And it's going to call the asynchronous function from the Firestore manager. This is why this function itself is also going to be asynchronous, and it's going to return a future. And now I'm going to use the same instance to the Firestore manager. So Firestore manager dot, and of course I'm going to call my change task status function. And we need to pass the ID and the new completed status for this task. And this is why I'm going to need this information from somewhere. So I'm just going to get these two values as parameters to this function. And when calling these functions, we'll have to actually think where we're getting these values from. And once again, this is an asynchronous function, so I'm going to add here a wait. Now, I want to be able to call this function that's in the main widget from the current TODOs widget. The reason I prefer to do it here is that it's going to be easy for me to update the to-do list. And this is important because we're passing this list as a parameter to the current TODOs. If I make the update here, I will be able to update this list, and then the updated value will be passed to the current TODOs widget, and I will immediately see the update. So this is the reason I decided to place this change task status function here in this widget. But it does raise the question of how are we going to call this function from this widget, right? Because this is the widget that will be notified that an update needs to be made, because the user is going to check or uncheck one of these boxes, and then we need to call this function. But the function is in a different widget, right? The function is in the main widget, and the checkboxes are in the current TODOs widget. And this is why we're going to use a callback function. So this widget is not going to have the implementation of the function, but it will have a callback to this function. So as a parameter, we're going to pass this function as a parameter to this widget, to the current TODOs widget. And this way, it will be able to call the function from the other widget. So here, I'm going to define a callback function. So it's going to be a function. And this function, of course, has to have the two parameters that we defined, the string for the ID, and the Boolean value for the updated completion status of the task. And I'm going to call this callback change TODO status. And now we can see that our constructor complains, but this is okay. We're going to require the calling widget to pass the implementation for this callback function. So here I'm going to add another required, and it's going to be this function. So now when we are using the current TODOs widget here, we have to pass the function that we want to use. And this is, of course, going to be this function, the change task status function. So let's pass it as the second parameter. So our change TODO status is going to be this function. And now in the function that handles changes to the checkboxes, I'm simply going to call this callback. So here, let's call change to do status. And this function expects two parameters. So the first one is the ID of the task, and the second one is the updated value. Now, the updated value is really not a problem. It's written here. This is the new value. And this is going to be the second parameter. But how are we going to get the ID of the task? Just as we could access the current completed status of the task, maybe we can also access its ID. But the thing is that here, we're not going to have an ID. And we need to understand why it's not going to work this way. So let's go back to our Firestore manager. And let's see what we can expect when we are fetching the to-do item. So here we are going over the documents one by one. And for each one of them, we are extracting the data for the document and adding it to our list. But what are we going to have in the data for each of the documents? So as we can see here, we're only going to have the completed and title fields. We're not going to have the ID. And this is because this is how documents are stored in Firestore. Each document has its ID and it also has its data. But if we're looking at the data, right, and this is what we are getting here, only the data, it's different than the ID, it's distinct. So if we are only getting the data, we're not going to have the ID. And this is why here, on top of the data that I extract from the document, I want to add one more field to my item map. And the thing that I want to add is, of course, the ID of the item. So in my map, I'm going to create another field or another key, and I'm just going to call this key ID. And now I'm going to get the ID of the document. Now from the document itself, I can get its ID, just as I could get its data. But now I'm going to store it in my map, in the map for this item. So the ID for this item is going to be the ID of the document, which we can access by doc.id. And now we're going to have a list where each of the maps, in addition to the title and the completed, is also going to have the ID of the document. And now, if we're going back to our widget, now we can do that. Now we can access the ID, because we know that our map is supposed to contain this key. But once again, it's better to be explicit about the conversion of this dynamic, because as we remember, this is a map of dynamic things. The keys are strings, but the values are dynamic. And I want the ID to be regarded as a string, so S string. And also here, the argument is nullable, so I'm going to add here an exclamation mark. And let's restart our application. And now I can mark one of the tasks as completed, let's say this one. And even though we updated its state, we still do not see the update here. But if we look at the database itself, we can look for this document here, and here it is, and we can see that it was updated. We can see that it's completed is true. So we need to find a way to retrieve the updated information from the database. Luckily, we already have a way, so let's get back to our main widget. And all I'm going to do here, after updating the to-do item, is call this function, the getToDos. Because as we already know, this function updates the to-do list itself, which is the list that we are passing to the current to-dos widget. And this way, the data will be refreshed. So here, let's add a call to getToDos, and let's refresh the application. And now I can, for example, uncheck this box, and I can see that it is updated. The last thing that I want to be able to do is to delete or remove existing to-do items. So let's start with the UI. I want to have a trash bin, a small deletion icon to the right of each of the elements. So down here, after the text that shows the title of the element, I'm going to add an icon button. We will need to write a callback for this button, but let's start with the icon itself, and this is going to be a trash bin icon or the deletion icon. And now we can see the deletion icon to the right of each of the items. Now, what about the deletion itself? So I'm going to follow something very similar to what we did for the update. So let's start with the Firestore manager, and actually I'm just going to copy this function. But this one is going to be delete to-do item, because we already have one that updates. And here we only need one parameter. We need to know which task or which to-do item we want to delete. And this is why we do need the string parameter, but we don't need the completed, because there is nothing to complete here. We just want to remove it. So let's delete this parameter. And once again, we need to access a specific document using the collection reference to access this specific document identified by its ID. But now instead of update, I want to just call delete. And now in the main widget, I want to wrap this function. So I can call it and immediately update the to-do list field. So here, we're going to have this new function. So let's call it delete to do. And once again, it's calling an asynchronous function. So the return type is going to be a future. And now we should be able to call the deletion function from the Firestore manager. So I'm going to use the same instance of the Firestore manager, but this time we're going to call the delete to do item function. And of course, we need to pass the ID of the item that we want to delete. And once again, I'm going to accept it as a parameter to this function. And let's add here a wait. And we already know that we'll probably need the get to-dos if we want our to-do list field to be updated. So let's copy this line and paste it here. And now our current to-dos is going to require an additional function. So on top of this one that is there in order to update an existing to-do item, we also want one to remove an item. So let's add here another function, and I'm going to call it delete to do. And once again, this is going to be final. And this function is only going to have one parameter for the ID of the to-do item that we want to remove. And of course, we have to require this. And now all we need to do whenever we click on any of the delete icons, so here is the callback, and I'm simply going to call my delete to do callback that I got as a parameter to this widget. So delete to do. And as a parameter, we need to pass the ID of this to-do item, so we know which one we need to remove. And just as we did here, we already know the ID of the item, so I'm going to copy this, and this is what we're going to pass as a parameter to this function. And back in our main widget, we should probably pass this function, the to-do function, to our to-dos widget. So here, I'm going to add it as the delete to-do function. And let's restart the application. And now I can add new items. For example, take out the trash. And I can add it to my list. I can change its state by clicking here on the checkbox, and I can also remove it by clicking here on the deletion icon, and it was removed.